pregnant widow was chained to a wagon until a stranger whispered, "You were promised." The desert had no mercy. It never did. It took what it wanted and gave nothing back. Not shade, not water, not hope. And on this day, beneath a sun that burned white and angry, it was taking her too. Her name was Emma Cole. She was 23 years old. She was 6 months pregnant, and she was chained to the back of a wagon like an animal. The iron cuffs bit into her wrists. The metal was hot from the sun, blistering against her skin. Her feet dragged through the dust, stumbling over rocks and thorns, trying to keep pace with the wagon that pulled her forward without pause. The men who drove it did not look back. They did not care if she fell. They did not care if she bled. She had stopped asking them why. 3 days ago, they had come to her small ranch just outside of Silver Ridge. 3 men, hard-faced and cold-eyed. They said her husband owed them money. They said he had made promises he never kept. They said the debt was now hers to pay. But her husband was dead. He had been dead for 2 months. She told them this. She begged them to understand. She showed them the grave behind the house, the wooden cross she had carved herself because there was no money left for a preacher. She told them there was nothing to take, no cattle, no gold, no land worth claiming. Only a widow and the child growing inside her. They took her anyway. They did not explain. They did not negotiate. They simply chained her wrists and tied her to the wagon, and they rode out into the open desert as if she were cargo, as if her life had no weight at all. Now, on the 3rd day, Emma could barely feel her legs. Her dress was torn and caked with dust. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. The baby inside her kicked weakly, as if it too was losing the will to fight. She pressed one hand against her belly, the only comfort she had left, and whispered the same word she had whispered every night since her husband died. "I will keep you safe. I promise. I will keep you safe." It was the same promise he had made to her, the same promise he had broken. She did not blame him. He had tried. He had worked the ranch alone when the other ranchers refused to help. He had ridden into town when the sheriff turned his back. He had stood his ground when men with guns told him to walk away. And in the end, it had killed him. She found him in the barn one morning, collapsed beside the horse he had been saddling. There was no wound, no blood, just a man who had worked himself to death trying to protect what little they had. And now, she was paying the price for his courage. The wagon lurched forward, and Emma stumbled. Her knees hit the ground hard, and pain shot through her legs. She gasped, tried to pull herself up, but the chains held her down. The wagon did not stop. It dragged her forward, scraping her knees against the rocks until she found her footing again. One of the men glanced back. He was thin, with a face like leather and eyes that held nothing. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a dying horse, assessing whether it was worth the trouble to keep it alive. "Keep up, widow," he said flatly, "or we'll leave you where you fall." Emma said nothing. She had learned that silence was safer than words. The sun climbed higher. The heat pressed down like a hand over her mouth. She focused on the rhythm of her steps. Left, right, anything to keep her mind from the pain, from the thirst, from the terrible certainty that she would not survive this. She reached up with trembling fingers and touched the locket that hung around her neck. It was small and silver, tarnished with age. Inside was a lock of her husband's hair and a tiny photograph of the two of them on their wedding day. She had sold everything else, her mother's ring, the quilt from her grandmother, even the good plates, but she could not sell this. It was all she had left of him. It was all she had left of the life they were supposed to live. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The way he used to smile when he came in from the fields. The way he kissed her forehead before he rode into town. The way he whispered to her belly at night, telling their unborn child stories about the stars. He had been a good man, a quiet man, the kind of cowboy who kept his word and asked for nothing in return. And they had killed him for it. She did not know who they were. She did not know what he had seen or what he had refused to do. But she knew, deep in her bones, that his death had not been an accident. And she knew that these men, these cold, silent men who dragged her through the desert, were part of it. The wagon slowed. Emma looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. Ahead, the horizon shimmered with heat. But there, cutting through the haze, was the silhouette of a rider. A lone rider, on a tall horse, moving slowly toward them. The men saw him too. The driver pulled the reins, and the wagon came to a stop. Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her wrists still locked in the iron cuffs. She could feel the weight of the locket against her chest, heavy as a heartbeat. The rider came closer. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face. His coat was dusty and worn, the kind a drifter wears when he has no home to return to. At his side hung a revolver, old but well kept. He rode like a man who had been riding for a long time, steady, unhurried, as if he had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Even from a distance, even beneath the shadow of his hat, she could see them. Dark, tired, filled with something she could not name. Sorrow, maybe, or guilt. The thin man stepped down from the wagon and walked forward, one hand resting on his gun. "You lost, stranger," he called out. The rider did not answer. He simply stopped his horse a few yards away and looked past the man, looked directly at Emma. And in that moment, she felt something shift. It was not hope. Hope was too bright a word for what stirred inside her. It was something quieter, something deeper. Recognition, not of his face. She had never seen this man before, but of the way he looked at her, the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand slowly, carefully moved away from his gun, not in surrender, but in restraint, as if he knew her, as if he had been looking for her. The thin man stepped closer, blocking her view. "I asked you a question, cowboy." The stranger's voice was low. "Steady. I'm not lost." "Then ride on." The stranger's gaze did not move. Not yet. The thin man's hand moved to his gun. And Emma, still kneeling in the dust, still chained and bleeding and broken, felt something she had not felt in months. She felt seen. The standoff lasted only a moment. But in the desert, moments stretched like shadows at dusk, long and heavy and full of things unsaid. The thin man's hand hovered over his gun. The stranger sat motionless on his horse, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Emma knelt in the dust between them, her wrists raw from the chains, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The sun beat down without mercy. The air smelled of sage and heat and something darker, something like fear. Then the stranger spoke again. Let her rest. His voice was quiet, calm, but there was iron beneath it. The thin man laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You giving orders now, cowboy?" The stranger did not move. "I'm asking." "Well, I ain't listening." The stranger's jaw tightened. For a moment, Emma thought he would reach for his gun. She could see the way his fingers flexed, the way his body shifted just slightly in the saddle. But he did not draw. He simply looked at the thin man with those dark, tired eyes and said nothing more. The thin man spat into the dirt and turned away. "Get back on a wagon," he barked at the driver. "We're moving." The driver cracked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. Emma stumbled to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. The chains pulled tight, and she followed, step by aching step, back into the rhythm of suffering she had learned over the past 3 days. But this time, she was not alone. The stranger rode beside the wagon now. Not close enough to interfere, not far enough to leave. He kept pace with them, his horse moving steady and sure, his presence a quiet shadow against the endless stretch of desert. He did not speak. He did not look at the man. He only watched her. Emma did not understand it. She did not know who he was or why he had stopped. She did not know if he was friend or enemy, savior or threat. But she felt the weight of his gaze, and it was not cruel. It was not empty. It was something else entirely. It was grief. The kind of grief that a man carries when he has lost something he can never get back. She wanted to ask him why. She wanted to know what he saw when he looked at her. But her throat was too dry, her body too weak. So she walked in silence, and he rode in silence, and the desert stretched on around them like a grave without walls. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent toward the horizon. The heat pressed down like a hand over her mouth, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. Her legs moved on instinct now, one foot in front of the other because stopping meant falling, and falling meant being dragged. The baby inside her kicked weakly. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering words she could barely hear herself. Hold on. Just hold on a little longer. She did not know if she was speaking to the child or to herself. The stranger heard her. She saw the way his eyes flickered toward her hand, toward the curve of her belly beneath the torn fabric of her dress. His expression did not change, but something in his posture softened. He looked away, out toward the empty horizon, and his hand tightened on the reins. He knew. Somehow, he knew she was carrying a child, and it mattered to him. By the time the sun touched the edge of the earth, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, the thin man finally called for a stop. They had reached a shallow basin surrounded by rocks and scrub brush. It was not much, no water, no shade, but it would do for the night. The driver climbed down from the wagon and began unhitching the horses. The other two men, who had ridden ahead most of the day, dismounted and started gathering wood for a fire. The thin man walked over to Emma and unlocked the chains from the wagon, though he left the cuffs on her wrists. "Sit," he said flatly. Emma sank to the ground, her legs giving out beneath her. She leaned back against a rock and closed her eyes, every muscle in her body screaming with pain. She could feel the baby moving inside her, restless and uncomfortable. She wished she had water. She wished she had food. She wished she had the strength to run. But she had none of those things. The stranger dismounted and led his horse a short distance away. He did not approach the fire. He did not speak to the men. He simply stood at the edge of the camp, watching, waiting, like a wolf that knows better than to turn its back on a pack of dogs. The thin man noticed. He walked over to the stranger, hands resting on his belt. "You planning to ride with us all the way to Canyon Bluff, cowboy?" The stranger did not answer. "Or maybe you got business with the widow?" Still, the stranger said nothing. The thin man smiled. It was a thin, cruel smile. "Suit yourself. But if you're thinking about being a hero, you might want to reconsider. There's 3 of us. One of you. And she ain't worth dying for." The stranger's gaze shifted, just for a moment, toward Emma. Then back to the thin man. "That's where you're wrong." The thin man's smile faded. The stranger turned and walked back to his horse. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and crossed the camp toward Emma. The thin man watched him but did not move. The stranger knelt down beside her and held out the canteen. Emma stared at it, then at him. Up close, she could see his face more clearly now. He was older than she had first thought, maybe 35, maybe 40. His face was weathered and scarred, the kind of face that had seen too much sun and too much violence. But his eyes were gentle. "Sad. Drink," he said quietly. She took the canteen with shaking hands and lifted it to her lips. The water was warm, but it was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, knowing it might be the only kindness she received tonight. When she was finished, she handed it back to him. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and started to rise. But then she asked the question that had been burning inside her all day. "Why are you helping me?" The stranger paused. He looked down at her, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, so softly she almost missed it, he spoke a single name. "Thomas Cole." Emma's heart stopped. That was her husband's name. The stranger saw the shock in her face. He saw the way her hand moved to the locket around her neck, the way her breath caught in her throat. He looked away, his jaw tight, his shoulders heavy with something that looked like shame. "I knew him," the stranger said quietly. "Your husband. I knew him." Emma could not speak, could not breathe. The world seemed to tilt around her. The stranger stood and walked back to his horse without another word. He did not explain. He did not offer comfort. He simply left her there, sitting in the dust, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions she did not know how to ask. The fire crackled. The men laughed and passed a bottle between them. The night fell heavy and cold over the desert, and Emma sat alone in the dark, clutching the locket around her neck, feeling the ghost of her husband's name settle over her like a shroud. Who was this man? How had he known Thomas? And why Why did he look at her with the eyes of someone who had already failed? The fire had burned down to embers by the time the men fell asleep. They lay scattered around the dying light, their bodies sprawled carelessly in the dirt, rifles within reach, but minds dulled by whiskey and exhaustion. The thin man snored softly, his hat pulled low over his face. The driver lay on his side, one arm tucked beneath his head. The third man, silent and watchful even in sleep, had his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Emma did not sleep. She could not. Her body ached in ways she had not known were possible. Her wrists were raw and bleeding beneath the iron cuffs. Her feet were torn and blistered. The baby inside her had stopped moving hours ago, and the silence terrified her more than the pain. She pressed her hand to her belly and whispered prayers she was not sure anyone was listening to. The desert night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to help. The stars above were sharp and bright, scattered across the black sky like broken glass. The moon hung low and pale, casting long shadows across the rocky basin. And in those shadows, the stranger waited. She had watched him throughout the evening. He had not joined the men at the fire. He had not eaten. He had simply sat at the edge of the camp, his back against a boulder, his rifle across his lap. He did not sleep either. He only watched the men, watched the darkness, watched her. Now, as the camp settled into stillness, he moved. He rose slowly, carefully, his boots making no sound against the earth. He checked the men one by one, making sure they were deep in sleep. Then he crossed the camp toward Emma, his shadow falling over her like a question she did not yet know how to answer. She tensed as he approached. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to trust him. God, she wanted to, but trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Every man who had promised to help her had either died or turned away. And now this stranger, this silent cowboy who knew her husband's name, was standing over her in the dark. He knelt down beside her, and the moonlight caught his face. She could see the lines etched deep around his eyes, the scar that ran along his jaw, the weight of something heavy pressing down on his shoulders. He looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small and folded. A piece of paper, old, worn at the edges, stained with something dark that might have been dirt or might have been blood. He held out to her. Emma stared at it, then at him. "What is this?" she whispered. "Read it," he said quietly. "But not here. Not now. Wait until morning." When they're distracted, her hands trembled as she took the letter from him. The paper was soft and fragile, like it might fall apart if she held it too tightly. She could feel the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the weight of whatever truth it carried. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. The stranger looked away, out into the darkness. For a long moment, he did not answer. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, he said, "My name is Jacob Wilder. I rode with your husband 5 years ago, before he settled down, before he married you." Emma's chest tightened. Thomas had never spoken much about his past. He had told her he used to work the cattle trails, that he had been a drifter before he bought the ranch. But he had never mentioned a friend named Jacob. He had never mentioned anyone. "He saved my life once," Jacob continued, his voice low and rough, like gravel underfoot. "Out near the Rio Grande. We got caught in a gunfight with a gang of outlaws, bad men, the kind who kill for sport. Thomas pulled me out of the line of fire, took a bullet in the shoulder doing it. Could have left me to die, but he didn't." He paused. His jaw tightened. "I told him I owed him. Told him if he ever needed anything, I'd be there." He just laughed. Said a man doesn't keep score with his friends. Said the only thing that matters is showing up when it counts. Emma felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. That sounded like Thomas. That sounded exactly like him. Jacob looked back at her, and she saw the shame in his eyes. "But I didn't show up. Not when he needed me. Not when they came for him." "Who came for him?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. Jacob glanced over his shoulder at the sleeping men. then back at her. "Read the letter," he said. "It'll tell you everything I can't." He rose to his feet, silent as a shadow, and returned to his place at the edge of the camp. Emma sat alone in the dark, clutching the letter in her hands, feeling the weight of it pressed down on her like a stone. She did not sleep that night. She could not. She only waited. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, pale and cold, the men began to stir. The thin man kicked the driver awake and barked orders. They ate quickly, dried meat and hardtack, and prepared to move again. Emma was given nothing. No food, no water, only the chains and the road ahead. But this time, as the wagon began to roll forward, she kept the letter hidden beneath her shawl, pressed against her heart. It was not until midday, when the men stopped to rest the horses, that she finally had her chance. The thin man wandered off to relieve himself. The driver laid down in the shade of the wagon and closed his eyes. The third man stood watch, but his attention was on the horizon, scanning for threats. Emma's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas's hand. His careful, slanted script that she had seen on lists and notes, and the few letters he had written her during their courtship. But this letter was different. The ink was faded. The paper was torn at one corner. And there, in the center, was a dark stain that she now knew was blood. Her blood ran cold as she began to read. "Emma, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. And I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I try to keep you safe. I try to keep this away from you. But I always knew, that it might come for you anyway. The men who will come are not debt collectors. They are killers. 3 years ago, I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. A murder. A rancher named Samuel Graves, gunned down in cold blood by a man named Cutter and his gang. They killed him for his land, for his water rights, for nothing but greed. I was working the cattle drive that passed through his property. I saw it happen. I saw them shoot him in the back. I saw them burn his house with his family still inside. And I ran. I ran like a coward, Emma. I didn't go to the sheriff. I didn't testify. I just ran and hid and tried to forget. But men like Cutter don't forget. And now they're coming to make sure I never talk. If I'm dead, they'll come for you next. They'll say I owe them money. They'll lie. They'll take everything. I gave this letter to Jacob. He's the only man I trust. If he finds you, trust him. He'll protect you. He'll keep the promise I couldn't. I love you, Emma. I love our child. And I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to keep you safe." Emma's hands shook so violently that the letter nearly slipped from her grasp. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. Her husband had not been a debtor. He had been a witness. And these men, these cold, cruel men who dragged her through the desert, were not here for money. They were here to silence her, to erase the last living connection to the truth Thomas had carried. She looked up and found Jacob watching her from across the camp. His eyes met hers, and in that moment she understood. He had not come to save her out of duty. He had come because he had failed once before, and he would not fail again. Dawn came slowly to the desert, the way it always did, hesitant, as if even the sun was reluctant to bear witness to what men did in the dark. Emma had not slept. She sat against the rock where they had left her, the letter folded and hidden beneath her dress, pressed against her skin like a second heartbeat. Her wrists were still locked in iron. Her body still ached. But something inside her had shifted. The fear was still there. It would always be there, but now it had company. Now she knew the truth. And the truth, however terrible, was a kind of freedom. Jacob had not moved from his place at the edge of camp. He sat with his back against the boulder, his rifle resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had not slept either. Emma could see it in the way he held himself, alert, coiled, like a man waiting for the moment when everything would either break or hold. The thin man stirred first. He sat up, groaning, and spat into the dirt. He looked at Emma, then at Jacob, his eyes narrowing. "You still here, cowboy?" Jacob did not answer. The thin man stood and stretched, his bones cracking in the cold morning air. He walked over to the driver and kicked him awake. "Get up. We're moving." The driver groaned and rolled over. The third man, the silent one, was already awake. He sat cross-legged by the dead fire, cleaning his revolver with slow, methodical strokes. His eyes flickered toward Jacob, assessing, calculating. The thin man walked over to Emma and unlocked her chains from the rock. He yanked at her feet, and she stumbled, her legs weak and unsteady. He did not care. He simply dragged her toward the wagon and locked her chains back to the iron ring at the rear. But this time Jacob stood. He rose slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. He did not draw. He did not shout. He simply walked forward, his boots crunching softly against the gravel, until he stood between the thin man and the wagon. The thin man stopped. His hand moved his gun. "You got something to say, cowboy?" Jacob's voice was quiet. "Steady. Let her go." The thin man laughed. It was a cold, bitter sound. "Or what? Or I'll make you." The driver stood now, his hand on his rifle. The silent man rose too, his revolver hanging loose at his side. 3 men. 1 cowboy. The odds were clear. But Jacob did not flinch. The thin man studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You really willing to die for her?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I'm willing to die for what's right." "Right?" The thin man spat the word like it tasted foul. "There ain't no right out here, cowboy. Only strong and weak. And you're outnumbered." "Maybe," Jacob said, "but you'll be the first to fall." The silence that followed was heavy and sharp, like the air before a storm. Emma could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the way the men positioned themselves, the way their hands hovered over their guns. This was it. This was the moment when everything would either break or hold. But then the silent man spoke. He had not said a word since they had taken her. He had only watched, only waited. But now, in the pale light of dawn, he finally broke his silence. "Let her go, Cutter." The thin man, Cutter, turned sharply. "What?" The silent man holstered his revolver. "I said let her go. This ain't worth dying for." Cutter's face twisted with anger. "You turning on me, Sam?" Sam shook his head slowly. "I ain't turning on nobody. I'm just done. We came out here to silence a witness. But the witness is dead. His widow don't know nothing. And I ain't shooting a pregnant woman just because you're too scared to let it go." "She knows," Cutter hissed. "She's got the letter. I can see it in her eyes." "Then we take the letter and leave," Sam said flatly. "But we don't kill her. And we don't die for your pride." The driver shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the men. He did not speak, but Emma could see the fear in his face. He did not want to die either. Cutter's hand trembled on his gun. For a moment, Emma thought he would draw anyway, that he would choose pride over survival, that this would end in blood and dust and nothing else. But then Jacob spoke again. "You can walk away," he said quietly. "All of you. No one has to die here. Just unlock her chains and ride on. I won't follow. I won't tell the sheriff. You'll just be 3 men who made a choice to do the right thing when it mattered." Cutter's jaw clenched. His eyes burned with rage. But slowly, reluctantly, his hand moved away from his gun. "Fine," he spat. He pulled the key from his pocket and threw it at Jacob's feet. "Take her. But if I ever see you again, cowboy, I'll kill you where you stand." Jacob picked up the key. He did not respond. He simply walked over to Emma and unlocked the cuff from her wrists. The iron fell away, and she gasped, her hands flying to her raw, bleeding skin. She looked up at Jacob, tears streaming down her face, but he did not meet her eyes. He simply took her arm and guided her toward his horse. The men watched in silence as Jacob helped Emma into the saddle. She was weak, too weak to ride alone, so he climbed up behind her, his arms on either side to hold the reins. The horse shifted beneath them, sensing the tension in the air. Cutter stood with his fists clenched, his face red with fury. But he did not move. He only watched as Jacob turned the horse and began to ride away, slow and steady, into the vast emptiness of the desert. They rode for hours without speaking. The sun climbed higher, burning away the cold of the morning. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a sea of sand and rock and silence. Emma leaned back against Jacob's chest, too exhausted to hold herself upright. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, The warmth of his body, the quiet strength that held her together when she had nothing left. She did not know where they were going. She did not ask. She only trusted that he would take her somewhere safe. It was not until the sun began its descent toward the horizon that she finally spoke. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, he replied, "Don't thank me. I should have been there sooner." Emma closed her eyes. "You're here now. That's what matters." They rode in silence after that, the only sound the soft clopping of the horses' hooves against the earth. As the light began to fade, a small town appeared in the distance, a cluster of wooden buildings and a church steeple rising against the darkening sky. Jacob guided the horse toward it, and when they reached the edge of town, he helped Emma down. She stood on shaking legs, her hands clutching his arm for support. "There's a doctor here," Jacob said, "and a boarding house. You'll be safe." Emma looked up at him, her heart breaking all over again. "You're leaving." It was not a question. Jacob nodded slowly. "I can't stay. Cutter might come back. And if he does, I need to be far away from you. Where will you go?" He looked out toward the horizon, toward the endless stretch of desert that had no beginning and no end. "Wherever the road takes me." Emma felt tears prick at her eyes. She wanted to beg him to stay. She wanted to tell him that she needed him, that her child would need him. But she knew better. She knew that some men were not meant to stay. They were meant to wander, to carry their burdens alone, to live in the shadows of the promises they could never fully keep. Jacob reached into his coat and pulled out something small and wooden. A cross, carved by hand, simple and rough, but made with care. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "Thomas made this," he said quietly, "for the baby. He gave it to me the last time I saw him. Asked me to give it to you if anything ever happened to him." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at the cross, at the lines and grooves carved by her husband's hands, and she felt her heart shatter and mend all at once. "He loved you," Jacob said, "more than anything, and he would have been proud of you." Emma could not speak. She could only nod, clutching the cross to her chest as tears streamed down her face. Jacob tipped his hat and turned to leave. But before he could take more than a few steps, Emma called out to him. "Jacob!" He stopped and looked back. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "You showed up when it mattered." Jacob's expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened, just for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked away, his silhouette fading into the dusk. Emma stood alone in the street, holding the cross her husband had carved, feeling the weight of everything she had lost and everything she had survived. The desert had taken so much from her, but had also given her something back. Not hope exactly, but the quiet, aching knowledge that some promises are kept not with words, but with the kind of faithfulness that asks for nothing in return.